Good afternoon. My name is Bruce Gunther. I'm the Chief Curator here at the Portland Art Museum and the resident curator for the exhibition, The Art of the Louvre's Tuileries Garden, which is on view through September 21st. This lecture is part of an ongoing program of exploring the ideas and issues raised by that exhibition, the opportunities to see original 17th century marbles that have never left France, and one of the best selections of 19th century photography that we've been privileged to show here at the museum. This has been possible through the generous support of a number of individuals in our community, of whom our lead sponsor is Laura Meyer, who generously stepped forward the minute she heard about the show and wanted it to happen. And so we thank Laura and the sponsors of the exhibition. I would ask you to put on your calendar August 9th and 10th for the second annual Paint Out in the Park. Artists, some 35 artists will be painting in the South Park blocks. Over the weekend, there'll be an exhibit of their work and a family day on Sunday when the museum will have a series of experiences and opportunities for families and children to think about parks, their design, their history, their place both in the daily lives of Portland and in the world of art. It is my pleasure today to introduce my colleague, Dr. Julia Dolan. She received her Ph.D. at Boston University on an interesting topic that informs, I think, much of her perspective on today's topic. She wrote about Louis Hine, the Empire State Building photographs, and their use in the popular press, the way they shaped consciousness and the politics of the period. It was an interesting topic and one that attracted us when she was presented to us from her Goldsmith Fellowship at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She has shepherded a number of exhibitions and presentations of our permanent collection since she joined our staff. I think we've all become fans of the 2M photo galleries and their periodic, every 3 or 4 month changeover, thematic, interesting, across platforms of history and style. She has brought new relevance and density to our thoughts about photography and its presence at the museum. Under her leadership, the collection has grown to some 7,000 images, and we are thrilled at what she is doing. She was our host curator and interpreter for Carrie Mae Weems, a major retrospective that went from here to the Guggenheim as our host curator. She wrote and spoke eloquently about that body of work for an artist who had started their career here in Portland. She is now sharing with us her thoughts on the 19th century photography in the Tuileries exhibition, and this fall has brought form and opens the world of substance of the activity of one of the most important photographic galleries on the West Coast, Blue Sky Gallery, the Oregon Center of Photographic Arts. She has authored a catalog of that exhibition, which she has selected to document the 40 years of activity in our community across the battle lines of is photography art to the moment in which can we escape photography and its ubiquitousness on our cell phones and lives. Join me in welcoming Dr. Julia Dolan.
Wow, hi everybody. Bienvenue. Bonjour. Where did you all come from? There are so many of you today. It's really wonderful on such a beautiful day. Thanks for joining us to talk about photography of 19th century France. I realized as I was putting this talk together that perhaps I should have tackled about 25 years rather than 60 to 70. So we're all going to learn a lot together and perhaps a little bit rapidly as well, but I think it will be well worth it. I would suggest that when you leave here, if you have time, do go upstairs to the Tuileries exhibition. I will not be talking extensively about the works that are in that exhibition. However, I will talk about the world in which those works were created up into the beginning of the 20th century. And I think it's with any luck, a good framework for you to approach the works that are in that exhibition. And what Bruce says is very true. The photographs that are contained within the Tuileries show are exceptional, and they are objects, many of which you may never see again here on the West Coast. So I do encourage you to have a look at them today if time permits, and come back often to see them before they leave. So let's move on to Paris. Let's move on to France in the 19th century. Although I am going to pretty much stay away from the United States, I'm going to begin with a quote by an American. The title of the talk, "The Mirror with a Memory," that is a phrase that has been incredibly meaningful to me, and I think just a wonderful way to encompass the idea of what photography is and how it presented itself and how it acted in the 19th century. And it is a quote from an article in the Atlantic Monthly that was published in 1859 by Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who was the American physician, professor, and poet, and father of the Justice. And he was very excited about stereo cards and being able to look at images in a sort of three-dimensional way. And he talks about photographs being mirrors with a memory. And I think that's so apt, and it's a wonderful way to look at French photography as a whole. A mirror that has a memory, I think in many ways encapsulates the present, and it also encapsulates the past, where photography as a new invention, as a new societal and cultural tool, propels France, propels Europe, propels the United States into the future. It's also a type of thing that at once records the present, that very quickly afterwards moves into the past. So a mirror is something that is very present. We stand in front of a mirror, we see ourselves in real time, we see reflections in real time. But the mirror with a memory, the photographic object, it photographs what is perhaps laying upon the mirror, but that by the time it becomes a photograph is already past. So I think it's important to remember and think about these ideas about how photography encapsulates the past, the present, and particularly in the 19th century, the future. I start with these two wonderful images. We will get to this fellow known as Nadar. His full name is Gaspard Félix Tournachon. Nadar rolls off the tongue for us English speakers a little bit more easily. But I start with him and move forward a little bit quickly. This is a wonderful rendering, if you will, of Nadar by the very well-known 19th century satirist Honoré Daumier. And it was published in Le Boulevard in May of 1863. And what it reads at the bottom is, Nadar raises photography to the level of fine art. And by 1863, it is certainly true that photography has taken over Paris, it has taken over France, it has taken over much of the industrialized world, and is this wonderful new tool. And we see Nadar up in a hot air balloon. This was a way of moving through the air from one place to another, and it's a way of surveying as well. It too is a new technology, and balloons represent this idea of moving forward, of science, of technology, of being aspirational, of being a people, a society in the 19th century that is aspirational and that is moving forward. We see him in some ways almost play acting in his studio on the right-hand side. That is not really him up in the air. However, he did go up in the air, and he did own balloons, and he did photograph from the air, and we will see that a little bit later. But I think it's also important, as I mentioned before, past, present, and future, and the idea of aspirations. We can't think of photography in a bubble. Photography moves along with our culture, with our history. And Paris and France, I keep saying Paris, I don't mean to do that, I mean to say France. France is quite an active place in the 19th century when we really start thinking about photography and its impact in France around the 1830s. I'm not even putting on this list, and I don't expect you to read through all of this, the French Revolution that had taken place barely 30 years before this, but you can see here that France is trying to figure out who France is and what France is. We're moving from a monarchy to a liberal constitutional monarchy. People are overthrown. In the Second Republic, it becomes increasingly conservative for a while. Napoleon III is supposed to be limited to one term, but in kind of a Michael Bloomberg way, he decides that one term is not enough. And suddenly we're into the Second Empire, and at first it's much more conservative, but as he loses popularity, he becomes more liberal. So there's a gradual shift toward modernization, increase in railroads, modernization of the city, and so on. And commercialism is very important in the city of Paris. We see the rise of the great department store and the change in the streets. They become much less difficult to get around and much more open. Boulevards are wide, and there are wonderful sight lines and so on within the space. But poor Napoleon III only lasts for so long. He surrenders to Prussia during the Franco-Prussian War, and the Second Empire collapses, and Paris won't give up, though. So most of the rest of France has given up, but Paris doesn't. So Paris is under siege, and people enter into a famine in early 1871. It's one of the worst winters that Paris has experienced. And then from there, the Paris Commune occurs, and the people, the communards of Paris, decide that they don't want to link to the larger French government, and things get very, very bloody about 2 months afterwards, and about 18,000 Parisians are killed. And so these are all things that are going on at the same time that photography is trying to figure out what it is. And photographers are trying to figure out what kind of product they can offer. Are we working with an art? Are we working with a science? Can photography be both things? So image making, art, it never, ever exists in a vacuum. So we'll move away from the chaos for a moment, a short respite. We'll have a look here at this portrait of Joseph Nicephore Niepce, who you will notice, poor fellow, this is a painting. This is not a photograph of him. And Niepce, unfortunately, even though he worked so hard to make photography a reality, he didn't live long enough to see it happen. And other people took over and became famous in terms of the photographic process when it was introduced in France. But over time, we have realized that Monsieur Niepce was also very, very important to this process. And something else I want to mention as we look at this image, you are going to notice a march of men during this lecture. Where are the ladies? For the most part, there aren't all that many. We are existing in the 19th century in France when colleges were not open to women until the later 19th century, much later 19th century. Women, until the end of the 19th century, couldn't have their own bank accounts. So options for women are very limited. There were photographic studios that were headed by women. A few were established by women, but for the most part, if a woman was running a studio, it was because she received it from her husband who had passed away. So unfortunately, we don't in France see too many women dealing with the art. If we move to Great Britain, we see a lot of women sort of working in and around their homes in photography, but for today, we will mostly be dealing with the men of photography. So Monsieur Niepce was a landowner not living in Paris, living pretty far east of Paris, and it was also an amateur scientist. This is a wonderful period where many in the landed gentry, many learned individuals were thinking about science, were thinking about industry, and were wondering where science could bring them and bring culture. He is someone who was interested in figuring out an internal combustion engine for boats. He and his brother were working on that type of machine. He was also very interested in trying to improve lithography and lithographic printing. So like oftentimes many gentlemen scientists would be, he would hop around to different things and try to create different mechanisms, different new ways of working with objects within the world. And this is really the image that he is best known for. And the history of photography sometimes tries to rest on this image, which is not necessarily a good idea. It's really important to not think of photography as a medium that was birthed whole. it didn't suddenly appear in 1839. It was a result of shifts in government, of shifts in culture, and shifts in society. And a more important question, other than saying this is the first surviving image, which is really amazing, I think the more important question is, how does an image like this become possible? Why did people within European and American society feel that it was important to fix an image, to make a reflection of the world, and to chemically make it stick, to chemically make it permanent? Why wasn't painting or lithography, sculpture, why wasn't that enough? There's a wonderful book called Burning with Desire, The Conception of Photography, which was written by Jeffrey Batchen, who's a professor of the history of photography, and it was published in 1997. And he does ask the question, when and why did photography move from isolated thought into a widespread goal? And it's important to remember as well that the Age of Enlightenment begins to occur in the late 17th century, and it promoted reason and scientific experimentation. We're moving away from more mystical ideas about our origins, about the world, moving a little bit more away from religion, trying to be much more rational. So we have rationality on the one hand and science that's building up. And then in the early 18th century, Romanticism comes into play as well. It becomes increasingly popular. It allows for a more emotional response, an emotional consideration, and an emphasis on the imagination. So that makes a really fertile ground for something like photography. We have the emotional, the artistic, but we also have the scientific, and both of those are gaining traction and gaining momentum. So photography did not spring forth in France out of nowhere in the 1830s. It was something that people were working on for quite some time. And the different pieces of photography existed separately about 100 years before photography was actually possible and made and offered to an audience in a commercial way. But no one was able to put all of those little pieces together yet, to figure out the entire puzzle and to make the image stick. They could make the images. They saw that silver salts and other different chemicals reacted to light. But how do you make it stay? How do you stop it from continuing to develop on the plate or on the piece of paper? So this is one of, at this point, we know is the earliest surviving example of an image that is fixed by Niepce. And that's why it's kind of sad that he didn't live to see the end, the real process become important, because he did figure out a way to make, for the most part, the activity of change through light stop so that an image actually rests on a plate. And this is a highly kind of manipulated version of this image. So what we see here is he placed his camera obscura, and that's really what a camera is. So the technology had been around for a number of centuries. It's just a dark box that has a lens on one side looking out into the world, and then on the other side it has some type of surface that will chemically react to the light that is coming toward that surface. So the image, if you want to go see it, it's in Texas at the University of Texas at Austin. It actually looks more like this. It's a pewter plate. It's really hard to see. I haven't seen it in person, but I want to. It's just amazing that back in 1826, Niepce somehow figured out that he could arrest this moment on what this, in this case, is a pewter plate. And this is a bitumen, which is a tar or an asphalt. And he figured out through different chemicals how to make it react to light. It looks, it's very faint. It's hard to see, and if you look at this one, it's kind of confusing. It seems very abstract. It's because it took anywhere from 8 to 10 hours to make this exposure. The idea of 1/5000th of a second of an image that we have now with our digital cameras, that you got to give that a little time. That didn't happen yet. The chemistry, as we know, was just not there yet. So he's successful in this way. He's gotten this far. But how does he get past that? Because it's really not viable yet. right? Like, are you going to have a person make a portrait and sit in front of a camera for 8 to 10 hours? Probably not. And there isn't all that much there yet. It's exciting and it's a beginning, but it's not enough. So this is a way that he is, because he was involved in engraving, remember he was trying to figure out better processes for lithography, he's using a metal plate. He had tried paper as the matrix before, or the surface on which the light-sensitive material would rest, but he ended up going back to pewter because engravers would work with metal plates. So what eventually happens is a lot of these people who are between 1750 and 1840 working in this vein don't really know about each other. There's no internet at this point. There are no telephones. You get letters and the occasional ship crossing the channel, but you don't, a lot of people aren't really active in talking about it yet. However, this debonair fellow, Louis-Jacques Mandé Daguerre, he does hear about Mr. Niepce, who's working out in the east of France. And what Niepce has, Daguerre does not, and what Daguerre has, Niepce does not. And they kind of sniff around each other for a while. They find out about each other. Daguerre really, really wants to know what Niepce has done chemically because he's stymied in terms of chemistry. And Niepce gets that feeling, but Niepce is running out of money, and Daguerre is well connected in Paris. So eventually they come to an agreement that they will partner to work on this photographic process that will bring them fame and money and stability. So what's so fascinating is Daguerre does not come from the type of wealthy landowner or semi-wealthy now landowner background that Niepce does. He does, however, come from an artistic background, and he was rather famous at this point in Paris, someone who is interested in vision, interested in optics, and very, very knowledgeable of art. So this is a 19th century illustration of a diorama, and I'll talk about the diorama in a moment. But before Daguerre was making dioramas in Paris, which he initiated, he was working in the panorama field, if you will. Individuals within Paris, within France, experiencing industrialization, experiencing more leisure time, perhaps more cash as well, more money, particularly the bourgeoisie, they were looking for forms of entertainment. And the diorama, being able to walk into a building and be surrounded by a massive painting, was incredibly entertaining, and people loved it. Well, Daguerre, after painting many, many panoramas, they were also incredibly popular in England and some in the United States as well. He developed the diorama. And the diorama is not in the round. It's still a very large painting, but it's on a screen. But it was more on like a transparent scrim where there would be one painting on the front and one painting on the back. And if you see the gentleman over to the right, he's behind the painting. And what he's doing is he's moving levers that change the light that's in the skylight above and behind the image. And so Daguerre figured out a way to make these paintings feel like they were moving and changing. So for quite a bit, it was not inexpensive to see a diorama show. People would be ushered into this room, and here you can see what is perhaps Mount Vesuvius erupting. So probably when we're looking at it, say, during the daytime, and it's lit from the front, it's just a normal mountain, and everyone's in Pompeii, and life is good. And then when the light changes from in front to behind, suddenly this raging inferno is occurring, and people are being swept up by lava and so on. On occasion, he would bring in actual flora and fauna. There is discussion of a goat in an Alp scene that was actually brought into the space. One wasn't enough. It would only go on for 10 to 15 minutes. So oftentimes the people that you see here would be on a platform that would actually rotate to the next panorama. So this is what he did. And he was very popular and made money from it, but it was not an inexpensive endeavor. And so he was trying to figure out what could he do next that would be enticing to people in the field of art that's also technological. And he too was thinking about keeping images from life on surfaces. This is the last extant example of a diorama that was made by Daguerre. It has recently been restored, so you can actually see it in Brie-sur-Marne, which is maybe 8 to 10 miles outside of Paris in the east. It's actually in a church in the town where Daguerre retired. And so on this small church, when he moved there, they built a small structure on the back behind the altar, and you can see the proscenium arch here, so it's very stage-like, which also there's a crucifix hanging down because that's typically where the altar is too. But it almost feels like the nave is continuing with this incredible diorama painting that you see in this little church. And during the daytime, it's as if you're in a cathedral in the daytime on the left-hand side when the light is shining from within the church. But if you take a look at the right, that's when the light has shifted and light is actually coming from behind the scrim. And it makes a completely different effect. So, this is not the stuff of, Steven Spielberg, but in the 19th century, it's amazing. It's really exciting. So you can imagine how much people love this kind of new viewing experience. Well, poor Monsieur Niepce passes away in 1833, and Daguerre keeps the information that he has learned from him and continues on. And by about 1838, he has finally perfected the daguerreotype. Yes, it becomes his name. The Niepce family does receive money, so they weren't completely left behind, but Niepce's name really disappears from the record books for quite some time. What has happened is Daguerre has finally made the leap from the individuals who knew how to make the image through chemistry. He has finally figured out how to make the chemical reaction with the light stop so that the image is actually fixed, sits on the surface, and will no longer change when you take out that image to show people. So for instance, this daguerreotype, this polished, it's a silver polished piece of copper, without being able to stop the chemical reaction, he could make this image in his camera obscura from his diorama offices near the Boulevard du Temple. But then when he would say, bring it out to show his friends and say, hey, look what I did with my camera obscura, as soon as he brought it out into the light, the action of the light would continue to darken and darken the plate till it went completely black. But he finally realized that through the action really of salt water, warm salt water would take away all the unexposed silver that would otherwise react to the light. It would just wash it all away. And now he has an image on a plate that is permanent. This is a really wonderful one. People actually love this image because of this. Some people say, I don't know that this is really true. Again, people love to be kind of what's the word I'm looking for? People want to be essential about photography. And it started in 1839, and these are the first people who ever showed up in a photograph. And it might not be really true, but it is incredibly fantastic to see. Any boulevard in Paris in the 19th century is not going to be this quiet in the morning. The reason that no one shows up is because this was probably about a 10 to 15 minute exposure as well. So anybody passing along the street, anything that moves too quickly is not going to show up in the image. However, we have this man right here who is getting his boots shined, and boots are kind of big. They take a while. So he and the young boot cleaner made it onto the plate. So Daguerre is very, very smart about how he introduces this information. He has an idea that other people are trying to get to this place. He had worked with Niepce. He knows that it's something that could be very important for him and very lucrative for him. How does he make it work for himself? Does he patent it? Does he make people get licenses from him? No, he doesn't. He actually goes to the government. So here we are, the middle of the 19th century in France. Another way to think about ascendancy. Daguerre goes to friends in the Academy of Sciences who are also linked to the government, and he says, this is the way for France to become that much more powerful. This is a catalyst to move France into a higher sphere in terms of science and in terms of the arts and in terms of culture. Let's offer this technology to France. And his friends in the French government do offer it to the government of to France, and it is decided that yes, indeed, this would be a wonderful, wonderful boon for the country, and on the world stage, make it look even that much better, that much more modern, that much more advanced. And what does Daguerre get out of it? He gets a lifetime pension. So he doesn't have to worry about, licenses and so on. He gets 6,000 francs a year. And then the Niepce family got, I think, 3,000 francs a year. So Niepce did, in the end, get a little bit, even though they're called daguerreotypes, not Niepceotypes. But this works out very, very well. And what was also incredibly smart, talk about marketing and commercial practice. The government announces that there is this new technology called the daguerreotype, that photography has arrived and we can arrest the world, the exact world that we see on a surface. And they announce it in January of 1839, but they don't tell anybody how to do it. So everybody hears about it and they want to see it. And even somebody like Samuel F.B. Morse happens to be in Paris that summer. And he sees Daguerre and wants to know how this process works. But Daguerre's not telling anybody, and the nation's not telling anybody. They finally, so it builds, all the excitement builds. And it builds in England. People in the United States know. And finally, what happens is they release the information to the world, and it's a joint, I love this part, it's at a joint meeting of the Science Society and the Société des Beaux-Arts. So it's the Society of Science and the Society of Arts together learning about how photography actually works. And that's, to me, it's perfect, because in many ways that is what photography is. It's both. We don't need to argue whether it's one or another. It just happens to be both. So people are super excited, and it's free to the entire world except England. So if you would like, even though relationships are better in England than they had been before between France and England for whatever reason, if you want to commercially work with daguerreotypes, you have to pay a licensing fee to France. If you're working in England, everybody else can do daguerreotypes for free. And this is what happens. I love this image, this lithograph from 1840. It's called Daguerreotype Amania. And daguerreotyping really does take over. There's so many different things to see here. I love the sun up in the left-hand corner, because without the sun, daguerreotypy is nothing. We see the balloon again, this incredible symbol of technology. If you notice, I'm not sure, you can kind of see it, the basket itself is a camera. Below that to the right, we can see what seems like worshipers circling around what is probably mercury fumes, a big vat of mercury. And then below that, you will see, over to the left, we see people hanging. And there are two different interpretations of this. One interpretation is that it's all of the engravers who have realized that they're done now, that they will have no more work. Other people believe that these are daguerreotype studio owners who have already gone out of business. I'm a little more inclined to think it's the engravers, because it's only 1840 at this point. We see this gentleman in the lower right-hand corner who kind of looks like a monster. He's being pinched in so that he doesn't move when his portrait is being made. It says appareil pour les portraits. There are different places here and there where it says all the equipment that you need if you want to take a trip and travel with a camera. We will return your prints to you in 13 minutes. In the top left-hand side, I think that these are camera kits being moved onto ships to go out into the rest of the world. In the foreground, in the center, we have a woman and a child standing in front of a photographer being photographed. So it really did take French culture by storm. It was a wonderful advancement. And in these numbers are kind of interesting. In 1848, which is almost 10 years since the announcement, there were only 13 photographic studios that were listed in the commercial journals of Paris, which seems really low, but this is where it gets back to social crisis and government intervention. There was an agricultural crisis in 1847, and then there was a kind of small revolution in 1848. You know, it's Paris, there are revolutions, and that led to a more conservative kind kind of Second Republic, and that threw off a lot of business. So in 1848, you see a more limited number of businesses, 13 listed in 1848, and then by 1868, the number has jumped to 365. So in 20 years, you have increased the number tens and tens and tens of times. So people loved making photographs and having their photographs taken. And I'm in love with this little daguerreotype. This one we actually own. This is in our collection. This is an image by Gouin, a portrait of a young girl from about 1850. What you see that is also aspirational here is people who were never before able to have their portraits made can now afford to have a portrait made. Not absolutely everyone. The proletariat, probably not, unless they save their money. That's not really true in the United States. Daguerreotypes became much cheaper in the United States much faster than they did in Europe, and particularly in France. So in France, it could be a little bit harder to get a daguerreotype made, but really all the strata of the bourgeoisie, from the petite bourgeoisie to the haute bourgeoisie, they were able to have these portraits made. And the more money you made, the more money you had to spend, the better portrait you could have made. But it allows you to have a piece of what wealthy people have. You can have your own almost miniature painting. And Gouin actually started out as a miniature painter, and then he switched over to photography. So that's why you see this one is beautifully hand tinted. He was really good at hand coloring the daguerreotypes, and so were his wife and his daughter. So that's where you see women coming into the photography world as well. They would come in through the back room. They were often the people who did the hand coloring of daguerreotypes. Not everybody is celebrating the fact that the daguerreotype is so successful. This is one of my favorite images ever. This is poor Hippolyte Bayard, who is one of the people who was working on his own photographic process at the same time that Daguerre did. Apparently, some people had heard that Bayard had these ideas, these chemical ideas, and rumor has it that they said, "Oh, don't talk about it yet. It's not ready. Don't talk about it yet," knowing full well that Daguerre was about to release his to the world. So boy, was he mad. And he made this portrait. It's called Self-Portrait as a Drowned Man in 1840. And this is a completely different process. This is a direct paper positive. So he's actually put this piece of paper into a camera. It has light-sensitive chemistry on it, and he's able to sort of print it out. It's not on a copper plate. And so he made this image, and on the back of it, this is brilliant, he wrote, and I quote, "The corpse which you see here is that of Monsieur Bayard, inventor of the process that has just been shown to you. As far as I know, this indefatigable experimenter has been occupied for about 3 years with this discovery. The government, which has been only too generous to Monsieur Daguerre, has said it can do nothing for Monsieur Bayard, and the poor wretch has drowned himself. He has been at the morgue for several days, and no one has recognized or claimed him. Oh, the vagaries of human life." So, guy's mad, right? And so mad that he records it. And what's really fantastic is if you look at this image, do you notice that his body in some ways is photographic? Notice the skin tone of his face and his hands compared to the skin tone of the rest of his body, which I find so fascinating. He reacts to light too, just like I do. I get more freckles now in the summertime. But clearly this is a man who is outside, but is very much covered up. But here he is showing us in a really interesting way that he too reacts to light, just like photography does. If you question how dramatic that statement was, just have a look at that. Of course, this is this wonderful image that David painted during the French Revolution, the death of Marat, and it is very, very possible that Bayard would have seen this painting because it did come back into the French consciousness right around this time. So yeah, there are people... When I was doing research on this, I thought, why is there no like off Broadway play or opera about the beginnings of photography? Because people sue each other, they get mercury poisoning, they get angry with each other, and people lose all their money. And it's very, very dramatic, as evidenced by this image. Here's another fellow that did not fare all that well in the announcement of the daguerreotype. He when the process was announced in January of 1839, Mr. William Henry Fox Talbot, landed gentry in England, said that he found out about it in England. He said, well, wait a minute. I've been working on something similar too. So in about 1833, he had been honeymooning with his wife and was trying to draw with something called a camera lucida, which is... it's too hard to explain, but it's almost like working with a camera obscura to draw. And he just wasn't very good at it. And he thought, God, there's got to be another way to capture this beautiful landscape of Italy. Why can't I just fix what I see? And as someone who was very learned and had grown up going to a number of universities and learned quite a bit about science and studied chemistry, he started working to find a process to make that happen. And he did. The only problem is he started having a family, and then he was elected to Parliament, so he got a little busy, and he never really told all that many people about it. But then when Daguerre came along, he said, but wait a minute, I've done this too. And nobody really paid attention to him. However, he did do what became the main method of photographic practice for over 100 years, which was the negative-positive process. When you deal with a daguerreotype, the image is sitting on a piece of metal. You cannot reproduce it unless you make another photograph of it. You can't shine light through it. It's not, although it is a negative, it doesn't function as a negative. You can't make positives from it. So what Talbot did is he worked with paper, and the object that was paper had light-sensitive chemistry on it and was placed in the camera, making a negative like you see here on the left. And then he could make, as long as the negative lasted, as many positives as he wanted. And that's what the commercial world needed. If you want to sell these images and move quickly, you need a negative to positive process. You can't keep making one-off daguerreotypes. There's only one of them in the world. Here you can mass produce. That's what industry allows you to do. So even though daguerreotypes were important in France, of course, eventually the negative positive process takes over daguerreotypes in France. And we come to this. We come to what is called the carte de visite, which is a little calling card. It's about the size of your credit card today. And it was a social currency, if you will. And André Diderot figured this out, that people could use photographs as social currency. When you were to go to visit someone at their home, you would bring what is called a carte or carte de visite with you that would have your name on it. That would be a printed card. Why not bring a photograph of yourself? And when you enter the parlor, when you enter the home, there is a table, and you would place your carte de visite on that table. And so now not only do we have your name, but we have your image also, and we can make photo albums out of these. So Diderot figured this out. He figured out how to make it more industrial, make it commercial, and make it profitable. These could be, as I said, reproduced over and over and over again. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, who I quoted earlier, he wrote later, quote, card portraits, as everybody knows, have become the social currency, the greenbacks of civilization. And hundreds of millions of them were made over time. And what was really important about these two, not only could you kind of keep memories of your friends and your loved ones, but as people became more mobile and transient, which was happening very much in the 19th century, and if you think about the railroads and the increase of the railroads in France alone during that time, people are starting to move away. People are leaving their families. This was a wonderful way to keep part of them with you. It's a way of keeping connections alive. Even though it's an image that moves us to the past because it happened in the past, it is keeping us in the present and making us also think of the future. Diderot really hit the jackpot in about 1859 when Napoleon III and Josephine and the family came in to have their carte de visite made. So this process was starting to become popular around 1855, but when people who were these important symbols of French aristocracy, of society, were having their own cards made, that meant that the proletariat, the bourgeoisie, could pose like Napoleon III or like Josephine, and could have a carte de visite like Josephine did. Queen Victoria loved carte de visite. She had approximately something like 100 albums full of them. So people of all social and economic strata were making them, and that's another way to move oneself into different circles. Here are some examples. Very famous people in the arts would allow themselves to be photographed, and they would be paid a fee, and then the negatives would be printed over and over and over again, and people would buy photographs of famous people for their albums as well. So they'd know people in their albums, and then the people that they liked would be in the album as well. And what you see on the right-hand side is typically you could get about 8 images onto one negative, and they could be in different poses. You could either have 8 poses that were all the same, or you could change the poses depending on how you worked the camera back and the lenses. And this is an example of one of the cameras. They would typically have about 4 lenses. And you could take multiple images on one negative at the time, and then you just contact print onto paper those 8 images, cut them up, put them on cardstock, get them out the door, and print them in the thousands if you want to. They were also really wonderful advertisements. Oh my goodness, your carte de visite is so beautiful. Where did you go? You flip it over, and that drums up additional business. Not everyone worked in this manner or felt that they should. We're back to the balloon man. We're back to Nadar. Nadar was a very interesting person. He is someone who's maybe in some ways trying to escape his past and move forward. He was someone who was born into the haute bourgeois, so he was fine. He was of a higher social tier. But he really fancied himself a free-spirited bohemian. And one way you can see proof of that is that he went by the nickname of Nadar rather than by his family name of Tournachon, which would have identified him to people as haute bourgeois. So he takes on this different name, and he spends a lot of time with other artists, people who he really liked. He at first was a caricaturist. We'll see one of his caricatures in a little bit. He was also a writer, and then he became a photographer. And he also was a balloonist, as I showed you in the beginning. His balloon was the largest balloon in Paris for a time. It was upwards of 12 stories tall when it was inflated, and he would photograph from there. So here he is having this magisterial gaze looking down on Paris and photographing from there. And actually, at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, when Paris was still under siege, his balloon was one of the only ways to get communications out of Paris to other parts of the country. So even though it seems very fanciful and kind of bizarre, it actually became very, very useful. He'd gotten into a crash, he'd broken both legs, but he loved his balloon. It was called the Giant. And it was quite famous. So he was perhaps socialist, but he later claimed to be anti-political. He wanted to be free-spirited and bohemian. He didn't necessarily want to deal with the moneyed class, deal with politics. He wanted to spend time with his friends who were these artists. And when you will see him move back and forth with that, though, because sometimes he needed money, so that he would move his way into the bourgeois world for a while and then move back. But what he decided to do, he was so interested in keeping these records of his wonderful friends that he did open a portrait studio. His portraits are very, very straightforward, quite simple. And yet beautiful. We see Sarah Bernhardt here on the left, and then the amazing Charles Baudelaire on the right-hand side from about 1865. He's newly in the business at this point. You'll see there's really nothing around them. Very simple, straightforward poses. Very beautiful light that falls on their heads. It brings attention to their minds and to their persona rather than the things that happen to surround them. An increasing clientele, however, over time. Here he is trying to be the bohemian, but people love him so much, the clientele gets bigger and bigger. He had to move his studio to the Boulevard des Capucines. He did not manage his money very well, though, and then by the time 1870, 1871 comes, you can imagine, during the Commune, nobody's getting their photograph made for the most part, at least not on purpose, and maybe not in a studio. So after that, things fall apart, and I'm going to show you this very quickly. This is the second location on the Capucine. And if you notice, it's kind of hard to see, but near the top studio, the wonderful kind of double level, almost atrium area, can you see the Nadar? Can you see? So this was a massive sort of red gas-lighted signature of Nadar. So he's gone from, I only make artist portraits and I'm not part of the establishment, to Nadar on Capucine. And as you can imagine, this is incredibly expensive, and he has debtors after him for a long time. I'm going to go back to this, though, very quickly, but this will give you the impression, we're doing okay, I got to move a little bit faster, but I really want to read this to you, because people are concerned at this time too. I haven't quite talked about it. what photography is going to do to art. What does it mean? Is it art? Is it science? Will it change art? And Charles Baudelaire, even though he gets this amazing portrait made, and many others made by Nadar and some others, of himself, he's not a fan at all of photography. And he wrote this in 1859, and indulge me, it's a bit long, but it's wonderful. And this is how he apparently feels about photography. And I quote, "During this lamentable period, a new industry arose which contributed not a little to confirm stupidity in its faith and to ruin whatever might remain of the divine in the French mind. The idolatrous mob demanded an ideal worthy of itself and appropriate to its nature. That is perfectly understood. In matters of painting and sculpture, the present-day credo of the sophisticated, above all in France, is this: I believe in nature, and I believe only in nature. I believe that art is and cannot be other than the exact reproduction of nature. Thus, an industry that could give us a result identical to nature would be the absolute of art. A revengeful God has given ear to the prayers of this multitude. Daguerre was his Messiah. And how the faithful says to himself, since photography gives us every guarantee of exactitude that we could desire, they really believe that, the mad fools, then photography and art are the same thing. From that moment, our squalid society rushed, Narcissus to a man, to gaze at its trivial image on a scrap of metal. A madness, an extraordinary fanaticism took possession of all these new sun worshippers. Strange abominations took form. By bringing together a group of male and female clowns, got up like butchers and laundry maids in a carnival, and by begging these heroes to be so kind as to hold their chance grimaces for the time necessary for the performance, the operator flattered himself that he was reproducing tragic or elegant scenes from ancient history. I am convinced that the ill-applied developments of photography, like all other purely material developments of progress, have contributed much to the impoverishment of the French artistic genius, which is already so scarce. I'm almost done, but he's mad. If photography is allowed to supplement art in some of its functions, it will soon have supplanted or corrupted it altogether, thanks to the stupidity of the multitude, which is its natural ally. It is time, then, for it to return to its true duty, which is to be the servant of the sciences and arts, but the very humble servant, like printing or shorthand, which have neither created nor supplemented literature. I am going to stop there because it does go on. He's really mad. And other people in the art establishment are mad too. And this is an engraving that Nadar himself did. Remember, he was a caricaturist before this. And this is the ingratitude of painting refusing the smallest place in its exhibition to photography, to whom it owes so much. So, certain people are accepting photography as being important to the arts, and other people are saying, oh my God, it's ruining the arts. But I think anyone who would gaze upon these amazing, amazing Gustav Caillebotte paintings would have a hard time saying that photography did not influence the other arts and was not meaningful to it. And I don't think that degenerated the form of painting in any way, shape, or form, and I hope you don't either. Quickly, I'll just go through a few more things. One more artistic, and then we will get to Baudelaire's request to please return photography to that of recording. I want to show you this beautiful Gustave Le Gray photograph. If you think that photography is only science, imagine making an image like this. This was really, really difficult to make a photograph like this that allowed for this kind of beautiful, this brig, this boat on this body of water, and that lovely light that hits the water to the right. And then these beautiful kind of fluffy but maybe ominous clouds above it and the sun breaking through. How absolutely gorgeous. Technology couldn't do this in one negative at this time. So Le Gray would actually make two negatives. He would make a negative for the water, and then he would make a negative for the sky, because the sky, the wavelengths would just blow out the chemistry. The chemistry couldn't handle it at that time, and then he would merge the two together. in the darkroom and make these magnificent images. He would go on to make recordings. This is what Baudelaire was talking about. He was brought into the service of the government and did something called the Mission Héliographique in 1851. The government's Historic Monuments Commission realized that they needed to restore and conserve the many monuments in and around France. But many of the governors on this commission hadn't actually gone out to various places in France and didn't know what was there and didn't know what needed to be saved. So they sent out a group of 5 photographers in 1851 all over France to bring back images of all these different monuments. And you see 2 examples here, Gustav Le Gray. Is this a document? Technically, yes. Is it beautiful? I think so. It's supposed to give information, right? And then Edouard Baldus, we see on the right-hand side, there are beautiful, exceptional Baldus images upstairs. I encourage you to go see them. These were all brought back, and the government was given approximately 250 of these photographs, and then they never did anything with them. So it was a really great way that the government could use photography, and nothing went on from there. But you will be pleased to know that poor Monsieur Béat, the one who had drowned himself in the photograph, he was one of the 5 photographers. So the government did finally thank him in one way. He was acknowledged for his photographic skills. And out of this Historic Monuments Division came assignments for people like Baldus, who is upstairs, to make documents of what is going on within Paris, within France as well. And so that's what you will see are examples from this project. He was asked to photograph the new Louvre as it was being constructed, as it was supposed to connect the Louvre and the Tuileries palaces together. So he would photograph these wonderful edifices, and he would also photograph these very small moments. And these were all put together in albums and presented to the government. And this was a really wonderful way of keeping a record of cultural patriarchy, but also show what was new, what was important, and could be used as guides later if necessary. The camera also recorded more difficult things in France. For instance, the barricades, things that were going on during the Commune of 1871, and there are a number of Commune images upstairs that you can have a look at as well. So this is amazing. It's an historic moment. It's important for the history of France to be reminded of what life was like in Paris at this time, how people within Paris said no to their government. They wanted a new government. They closed off the rest of France and tried to make their own way. So these are wonderful historic documents and wonderful moments of very proud people trying to take back their city, if you will. The only problem is when the government in Versailles sent in the troops and killed 18,000 of them and took the city back, these were also used as proof of people who were communards. And if it was proven that you were a communard, you would be summarily executed. So it worked in the reverse way. Photography also became a form of surveillance, and prints were made and sent out to the borders as well. So communards were being found at the borders through these photographs, trying to leave France. And then, unfortunately, you also you get documents of the aftermath as well. This is an example of executed National Guardsmen. This is not unusual. This was the first sort of war, if you will, that was photographed in Paris. But by this point, the Civil War had already happened in the United States. So it's not as if people have not seen images like this before, but it's the first time that people have seen it here. And then we unfortunately see these dead communards. They can also be identified by face, even in death. I'm almost done, I promise. The last photographer I want to talk to you about, who serves as a wonderful bridge from the 19th to the 20th century and into the future, is the amazing Eugène Atget. You get to see beautiful first-hand examples of Atget's work on the first floor of the Tuileries exhibition. Please, please do. He, in a very complicated yet fascinating way, bridges the past and the present and the future, particularly where the surrealists are concerned. So we're moving into the 20th century here. He was an actor turned painter who didn't love the way that his paintings were turning out, so he became a photographer. And he eventually made over 10,000 photographs of Paris and its surrounding locations. He made this incredible record of Paris that has been changing and changing and changing for so long, and is now moving into the 20th century and will continue to change. But people, as they move forward, as Parisians, as French countrymen and countrywomen, are trying to figure out what to discard from the past and what to hold on to, and how to move into the future, and what to keep in the future, and what to discard and try in terms of something new. And he's someone who, he doesn't overly sentimentalize the past, but he does use photography to capture at that moment what is the present and also the past as we are all moving into the future. And what's interesting too is that as time goes on, he starts photographing in the very late 19th century with an 8x10 camera, needs a tripod and bellows, very big. Cameras get smaller and smaller and smaller in the time that he works up until about 1927. He never changes his methodology. So it's almost as if, in some ways, people are moving to digital today, but he says, no, I'll stick with analog. I'll stick with the negative and the positive. Not necessarily complaining, it just works for him. And he captures beautiful, beautiful areas and sites and ideas about Paris. This is a Rue Mouffetard. If you see the church on the right-hand side, I think this is a wonderful example of the past combining with the present. This was photographed in 1899. The first church here on that site was built in the 11th century, and then it was rebuilt in between the 15th and the 18th centuries. So we see this incredible monument that is now butting up against advertising for commerce. This is an earlier kind of busy image for Atget. You will see over time that his photographs are much quieter. The Tuileries images are very, very quiet. He also does this amazing series of the petits métiers, or the small trades. So at the turn of the century, he goes about the city and records all these individuals who are rag pickers or chimney sweeps, window washers, and so on. And he records them with the tools of their trade in the space of Paris, and I think a really, really wonderful way, because many of these people too are also kind of falling by the wayside as things move forward. The surrealists loved images like this that he would make of the city, these kind of dark, foreboding, almost dreamlike spaces. But this wonderful Hôtel de la Salamandre, the Salamander, it's sort of the townhome of the Salamander. This was actually built by Francois I, who was a patron of the arts way back in the 16th century. And the reason that it's the word salamander comes up, the salamander was his emblem, and it's still, the doorway is still here today. I yanked this off of the wonderful internet, and you can see the salamander a little bit better there. And I thought, why would anybody want to be a salamander? But apparently salamanders can survive fire and squelch fire, so it's actually a very powerful kind of tiny newt. And so what's so interesting is what... I know I'm keeping it a little bit long. What Atget tries to do is really record these very important elements in Paris and beyond. So elements like that salamander, when you have a country full of people mostly illiterate, you use symbols. You use symbols over your wine shop. You use symbols at your cheese shop. You use symbols in churches. So that is how people understood what you were trying to communicate, what you were trying to sell. As this space turns from illiteracy to more and more and more literate, more knowledgeable about the world, little symbols like this, signs, feelings of the past, patriarchy are going away. And Atget very systematically records a lot of this. He never considered himself an artist. He considered himself a maker of documents. He would sell these documents to architects and to craftsmen and to the libraries in Paris so that they would have a record of what came before and what might be important to hold on to and not change as France moves and hurtles into the 20th century. And I'm going to end with this last Eugène Atget. This is one of my favorites. I used this in an exhibition when I was at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I love this image because he's referring to the sun. He's referring to what has brought us here. The action of sunlight and how it allows us to capture the world on a plate of tin on a plate of glass on a piece of paper. And here we have all of these people looking at an eclipse in Paris, and it brings us in some ways a little bit full circle. We have Nadar photographing from above, and we have Atjeh on the ground. He's looking at the past. Look at the space behind him, all this cultural patriarchy. And then closer up, people now know if you stare at an eclipse, it's going to hurt your eyes. Science is bringing us forward, and yet we're still so fascinated and so drawn by the sun, by its science, and what it can do. And as we sort of follow the sun and move forward into the future of photography, that's where Paris, that's where France was in the 19th century. It was unbelievably complicated and amazing and very special. So please take a look at these photographs. They really mean something. They will teach you something about the past. They will teach you something about the people who are portrayed in it and how they saw their world hurtling perhaps way too quickly into the future. Thank you. I am more than happy to take any questions if there happen to be a few.
And we do have microphones, so we just ask that you wait to ask your question until a microphone has made it your way.
I see Todd's hand in the center. You have to wait for a microphone, yes. Thanks for coming, everybody. Bye.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Thanks, Julia. That was terrific.
Thanks.
How well does the permanent collection here reflect what you just talked about?
That's a great question. We have a number of French photographs, and I have brought a few more in the time that I've been here. It's not a major strength of the collection, but that's not necessarily unusual. We are all the way over on the west coast of the United States, and so in terms of patterns of collecting for patrons here who have donated and so on, the grouping of works isn't as strong. You will find stronger groupings of French photography on the East Coast and, of course, in England and certainly France. But we have a number. I have a couple up right now in the Halcyon Days exhibition that I have. That's the complement to the Tuileries exhibition. I'm always happy to take more French photographs, so it's such an important time period for photography. Thanks, Todd. Any other questions? We have one on the far right.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier that not everybody was happy at the advent of photography in France, and that indeed it was a commercial threat to, for example, the lithographers who feared losing their trade because of it. I'm curious whether there was also opposition on a moral basis, sort of analogous to what occurred when the Wright brothers were first experimenting with motorized flight in this country, and some people would say, well, if God intended for man to fly, he would have given people wings, you know, and I wonder if anyone had an attitude like that with photography. They actually had a fear that there might be a fear of misuse or just fear of the idea of having a permanentized image, which was something new to them, even though paint it had been done with painting, but this was like a literal rendition of a moment in life, something people had never known before and therefore might be afraid of. Interesting.
Thank you. Not that I'm aware of. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but if it did, it must not have been recorded. I haven't ever noted that in industrial countries. It's just not something that seemed to come up. The type of moral fury that you see is somebody like Baudelaire who's worried that it's going to dilute the art world and dumb it down, if you will. And some people still fear that, I think, to a certain extent today. But no, I've never personally come across anything that indicates that kind of feeling, but that's a really interesting question. Any other questions near the back? Yes. Microphone's coming.
One thing that caught my interest was the impact of the carte de visite on French society, and it's analogous to what the impact Facebook and other social media are at our current time, and
Yes.
the exchange of photographs. in the same fashion.
Absolutely. And that's a wonderful point. And there were so many, to me, fascinating parallels. I would, in some ways, equate the birth, if you will, of photography to the birth of the internet and what that meant to people. It just changed so much. And it is true, the being able to, Facebook in its own way can be a type of different, but an emotional currency, like a daguerreotype or a tintype or a carte de visite could be, and you can exchange these things. What is so fascinating is the fact that it's no longer physical like this. It's physical, through this or through my phone. And so what does that mean for the future of photography? Because the physical thing lasts in a different way and exists in time and space in a different way. So I'm always wondering if that will change, how that will change. We'll never go back, certainly, probably to carte de visite, but what will be next for photography after this? But that's an excellent, excellent point. Anything else? Thank you all for coming. Have a great rest of your afternoon.